The Oka Crisis was a 78-day confrontation that took place in the summer of 1990 in Quebec, Canada, between members of the Mohawk Nation, the Quebec government, the Canadian government, police forces, and eventually the Canadian military. Although many people describe it as a dispute over the expansion of a golf course in the town of Oka, the conflict was actually the result of centuries of disagreement over land, sovereignty, and the relationship between indigenous peoples and colonial governments. To understand the Oka crisis, it is necessary to look far beyond the events of 1990 and examine the history of the Mohawk people of Kanesatake. The Mohawks are one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Long before Europeans arrived in North America, they lived according to their own political, legal, and cultural systems. When French settlers arrived in the 17th century, relationships were established through diplomacy, trade, and military alliances. The Mohawk understanding of these relationships was that different peoples could share territory and coexist while maintaining their own identities and authority. However, European colonial governments increasingly applied their own concepts of land ownership and sovereignty. In the early 18th century, French colonial authorities granted control of land around Oka to a Catholic religious order. The Mohawks later argued that they had never surrendered, sold, or ceded the territory, and that any agreements made were meant to allow coexistence rather than permanent transfer of ownership. Over the following centuries, colonial and later Canadian authorities generally recognized the claims of religious institutions and settlers while rejecting or delaying Mohawk land claims. As a result, the territory available to the Mohawks became smaller while non-Indigenous settlement expanded. One area that remained especially important was a pine forest known as the Pines, which contained land considered culturally and spiritually significant, including a burial ground. In the 20th century, the Mohawks repeatedly attempted to have their land claims recognized through legal and political channels. These efforts produced little success. By the late 1980s, the municipality of Oka approved a project to expand an existing golf course and build luxury housing on part of the disputed territory. For many residents of Kanesatake, this proposal represented more than a local development project. It symbolized centuries of disregard for Mohawk rights and the continued loss of land that they believed had never been surrendered. In response, Mohawk community members organized protests and erected barricades in March 1990 to prevent construction from moving forward. Tensions increased as negotiations failed to produce a solution. On July 11, 1990, the Sûreté du Québec launched a raid intended to dismantle the barricades. The operation quickly escalated into a confrontation involving gunfire. During the exchange, police officer Marcel Lemay was killed. The circumstances surrounding his death remain debated, but the incident transformed the dispute into a national crisis. Following the raid, Mohawk communities strengthened their defensive positions and expressed solidarity with one another. Members of the Mohawk community of Conowique blocked the nearby Mercier Bridge, an important transportation route linking Montreal with its southern suburbs. The bridge closure caused major disruptions and generated strong reactions across Quebec. Some people supported the Mohawk position and argued that Indigenous land rights had been ignored for too long. Others viewed the barricades as unlawful and demanded that authorities restore access immediately. As the standoff continued, the crisis attracted intense media attention throughout Canada and around the world. Images of armed Mohawk defenders facing police and soldiers became some of the most recognizable photographs in modern Canadian history. The Quebec government eventually requested assistance from the federal government, and thousands of members of the Canadian Armed Forces were deployed to the area in August 1990. The presence of the military increased tensions, but also replaced the provincial police at the front lines, reducing the likelihood of another sudden armed confrontation. Negotiations continued throughout the summer, although progress was slow and mistrust remained high. The standoff finally ended on September 26, 1990, after 78 days. Many protesters left the barricaded area, and some individuals were arrested. The immediate conflict was over, but the deeper issues remained unresolved. The golf course expansion project was canceled, and the disputed land was later acquired by the federal government to prevent development. However, ownership was not formally transferred to the Mohawk community, and the broader land claim remained unsettled. The impact of the Oka crisis was enormous. For many Canadians, it was the first time they became aware of the depth of Indigenous grievances regarding land rights and the legacy of colonization. The crisis exposed the failure of governments to resolve long-standing disputes before they escalated into confrontation. It also demonstrated that Indigenous peoples were prepared to defend what they viewed as their ancestral territories when political and legal processes failed to produce results. In response to the events of 1990, the Canadian government created the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which conducted a major examination of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. Its reports called for significant reforms in areas such as self-government, land claims, and reconciliation. Today, the Oka crisis is widely regarded as a turning point in Canadian history. To some, it represents Indigenous resistance against centuries of dispossession. To others, it highlights the consequences of unresolved legal and political disputes. What is not disputed is that the crisis forced Canada to confront difficult questions about land, sovereignty, justice, and the meaning of coexistence between Indigenous nations and the Canadian state. More than 3 decades later, it remains one of the most important and influential events in the history of Indigenous government relations in Canada.